I was born and raised in Perth, Western Australia, and I loved it. An amazing country with outstanding people and breathtaking views. But sadly, once the coronavirus pandemic hit, Australia went the way of the Florida man and became insane. In this video, I'll do my best to argue that the typical handling of the pandemic by most governments, with an inevitable focus on Australia, is more motivated by politics than public health. I will ultimately try and justify why I believe that COVID restrictions are largely unnecessary, disproportional to the threat posed by the virus, and more damaging than the coronavirus itself. To make my case, I have segmented this video into 19 parts that I believe covers every aspect of the pandemic. Before leaving a comment or deciding to like or dislike, I encourage you to watch the entire video first, then make your assessment. As you watch this, please note that all evidence presented in this video will accompany an in-text reference in the top right corner, which correlates with the source to the information mentioned in the description of this video. Unlike popular media and the local Karens having a public freakout in the local Tesco, I want you to develop your own opinions. So feel free to investigate, double-check, and research your own conclusions. This video will detail my personal take on the pandemic and my reasons for reaching these conclusions. With that said, let's begin. Australia's COVID-0 policy. Now, for some background on what's happening in Australia, recently the National Cabinet in Australia, led by current Prime Minister Scott Morrison, released an official statement where they champion the suppression strategy, which states the goal as suppressing COVID-19 until a point in time where a vaccine or effective treatment is available, with the goal of no local community transmission. This strategy spouted the infamous COVID-0 approach. Professor Rufaeel Prokopinko, a pandemic modelling expert and the director for the Centre of Complex Systems at Sydney University, is responsible for producing the COVID modelling designed to simulate future trends in infections, transmissions, hospitalizations, and casualties, in an attempt to anticipate and prepare for the worst. Professor Prokopinko stated that the task is bringing this to 0, not 5, not 1, to 0, because if you still have one remaining case, that one remaining case will go to 2 the next day, to 4 the next, and then you get exponential growth. Now, what I am arguing isn't that Australia shouldn't have been diligent and tried to mitigate the fallout of coronavirus, rather that the approach in which Australia has addressed the coronavirus is unethical and the land down under is guilty of human rights violations. Out of the 30 human rights set out by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Australia violates Article 13. Article 13. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. How exactly did Australia violate the rights of its citizens, of which I am included? By imposing the strictest border policies in the world. Australia's COVID policy sees Australian citizens like myself and permanent residents effectively banned from leaving or returning to their home country, rendering tens of thousands trapped. According to the BBC, Australians living overseas could be trapped in Australia if they return, after the nation's government tightened its border rules without notice. Alexandra Freeland, who lives in the US, tweeted she was waking up to news that I'm effectively exiled from my country. This means that if you're an Australian that lives and works in England or Abu Dhabi, and you wish to return home for a visit, you will not be able to return to your host country where you live and work as an expat. This is a major deterrent and, as Freeland states, will effectively exile you from your home country, a right guaranteed by Article 13 of our human rights. The BBC has been told of cases in the past year where Australians have been unable to leave to care for sick or dying loved ones or to retrieve their children from relatives. This is an all too common headline and has led to many other articles such as, "Why can't Australians get back into their country? The battle to open up Fortress Australia." This has led to legal experts questioning whether Australia's rules breach constitutional rights by effectively preventing some citizens from being able to return home. This is the boat I am in, unable to return home. There's a ban on overseas travel from Australia. If you're an Australian citizen or permanent resident, you can't leave Australia unless you're either vaccinated, which at the time was rare unless you're vulnerable or elderly, or you or your host country is exempt. Additionally, even if you did manage to pass exemption, Australia put a cap on their international arrivals, meaning the Australian government put a limit on how many of its stranded citizens it would take in at any time. And this is a significant detail. Australia's cap on arrivals from overseas may breach international laws guaranteeing children can be reunited with their families and citizens cannot be excluded from their home, the Australian Human Rights Commission has said. National Cabinet capped weekly arrivals at 4,000 in July due to limits on hotel quarantine after Victoria suspended its quarantine program. Hotel quarantine was the bane of my existence for most of 2020, but a little on that later. As the number of Australians stranded overseas continued to grow, in Australia, National Cabinet relented to public pressure by lifting the cap to 6,000. Now, you may think, well, how many Australians are there? Surely 6,000 stranded citizens and permanent residents returning to Australia at a time will make quick work of the situation. According to 9 News, it's tens of thousands, ballparked to over 34,000 Aussies around the world remain locked out of Australia and can't fly home. Whereas other articles, like The Guardian, reports there are more than 45,000 Australians stranded overseas that registered for government help. Now, I'm an Australian citizen stranded abroad, and I never registered for government help, so this figure doesn't include people in my situation. So how many Australians are stranded abroad? The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says at least 25,000 Australians, many of whom are financially and medically vulnerable, have registered their need to come home since July. However, the Board of Airline Representatives of Australia estimates the true number of those stranded is closer to 100,000. 100,000. That's supposedly this many people. So now that we know that there's likely over 100,000 stranded Australians abroad, at what rate are they being returned home on those 4,000 to 6,000 weekly flights? Australia flight restrictions leave planes virtually empty. Inbound Australia flights are 13% full. What a waste of fuel, money, and everybody's time.
How dare you!
But at least it provides an avenue for those who want to return. Except, Australian government halves arrival cap, leaving thousands stranded as airfares skyrocket. And with halved arrivals comes double the market value as a result of the increasing scarcity. Simple economics really, which is summed up nicely in this headline. Australians facing flights costing thousands of dollars as demand skyrockets. So what's the big picture? In my situation, I was an Australian geography teacher who moved to England for work. And then, bam, pandemic hit. Better go home to Western Australia, I thought. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately given how everything played out, I ran into a series of significant barriers that dragged Australia further and further away. To illustrate, these lines will represent stranded Australians, expats, holidaymakers, the lot. Assume they all want to go back home to Australia. Your first hurdle is that all travel to Australia must be essential, and simply falling on your human rights and Australian passport isn't enough. So through the first obstacle some pass, and many fall behind. For those who made it past the first hurdle, you now need to compete for one of the 4,000 to 6,000 flights entering Australia every week. I've read that the waiting list for these flights is over 24 months, so good luck. Many fall behind, but some make it through. Your third hurdle is that you're going to need to quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel. The government chooses the hotel, your room will be locked from the outside, but significantly, you will have to pay. So, can you fork out $6,000 per person for a hotel? If you can, lucky you. You can make it through to your final obstacle. But if you're like the Keynes family, who were hit with a huge quarantine bill to visit their dying father, you'll find out the hard way that exemption for travel is not a blessing. 4 Australian children desperate to travel to see their dying father have been told the family must pay 16,000 Australian dollars or £9,000 in hotel quarantine fees to see him. Insanity. So, if you can't afford the hotel fees, back to square one you go. If you can, You now face the final boss. Can you afford to pay the extortionate price for the insanely rare flight to Australia? If you can't, you're back to square one and stranded against your will, while the government claims it's technically doing its part to provide means to return home for its citizens. If you can, congratulations, you're home. But are you fully vaccinated? For July 2020 me, working in Essex, my travel wasn't deemed essential, despite being an Australian citizen, so I was barred from returning home 3 times. Even if I was eligible, the waiting list to return was over 20 months. Even if it was my turn to board, I couldn't afford the hotel quarantine or the flight cost, so I was stranded and now I live in the Middle East. My experience is similar to that of many other Australians who were working or visiting abroad during the coronavirus outbreak and found ourselves basically rejected by our home country and unable to return, rendering us stateless. You know, that status Article 13 of our human rights was meant to prevent. Now, what I am arguing is that all of these policies and restrictions in response to the pandemic are grossly unnecessary on account of the virus we're battling being remarkably survivable and completely political, with little to no focus on public health, unlike the corrupt propaganda machines would like you to believe. Now, before you start disliking and leaving negative comments after hearing me describe COVID as remarkably survivable, I encourage you to hear me out until the end. If you do, I'll tell you a hilarious joke at the end. The blueprints of the pandemic. You will need one key term to have no problems understanding the next segment. That word is totalitarian, an adjective defined as relating to a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. According to Wikipedia, totalitarianism is a form of government and a political system that prohibits all opposition parties, outlaws individual opposition to the state and its claims, and exercises an extremely high degree of control and regulation over public and private life. It is regarded as the most extreme and complete form of authoritarianism. In totalitarian states, political power is often held by autocrats such as dictators and absolute monarchs, who employ all-encompassing campaigns in which propaganda is broadcast by state-controlled mass media in order to control the citizenry. It's important to understand the definition of this term, as you'll hear terms like totalitarian, draconian, and authoritarian heard throughout this video. But back to the blueprints of the pandemic. So, you're running the country, a pandemic hits, you want to handle it right. So you gather a group of scientists and they lay down the game plan, the blueprints to how you should handle the pandemic. But what do they recommend? Well, let's see. Members of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, the guys who advise ministers on how to manage ecological outbreaks like COVID, admitted to having expressed regret that their approach to handling the COVID outbreak was both unethical and totalitarian. How? By exaggerating the personal perceived threat of COVID by weaponizing fear to terrify the public into compliance. Their regret is that now members of the public treat each other like biohazards. In context, it reads, scientists on a committee that encouraged the use of fear to control people's behavior during the coronavirus pandemic have admitted its work was unethical and totalitarian. Members of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour expressed regret about the tactics in a new book about the role of psychology in the government's COVID-19 response. That book is A State of Fear: How the UK government weaponized fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. SPIB warned in March last year that ministers needed to increase the perceived level of personal threat from COVID-19 because a substantial number of people still did not feel sufficiently personally threatened. Gavin Morgan, a psychologist on the team, said, clearly, using fear as a means of control is not ethical. Using fear smacks of totalitarianism. It's not an ethical stance for any modern government. By nature, I'm an optimistic person, but all this has given me a more pessimistic view of people. Mr. Morgan spoke to author Laura Dodsworth, who has spent a year investigating the government's tactics for her book, A State of Fear, published on Monday. Ministers have faced repeated accusations that they ramped up the threat from the pandemic to justify lockdowns and coerce the public into abiding by them, a claim that will be examined by the forthcoming public inquiry into the pandemic response. SPIB is one of the subcommittees that advises the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, led by Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientist Advisor. Remember that organisation, SAGE, it will come in handy later. One SPIB scientist told Dodsworth, in March, the government was very worried about compliance and they thought people wouldn't want to be locked down. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance, and decisions were made about how to ramp up the fear. The way we have used fear is dystopian. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been a little weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. Another SPIB member said, you could call psychology mind control. That's what we do. Clearly we try and go about it in a positive way, but it has been used nefariously in the past. One warned that people use the pandemic to grab power and drive through things that wouldn't happen otherwise. We have to be very careful about the authoritarianism that is creeping in. Another said, without a vaccine, psychology is your main weapon. Psychology has had a really good epidemic action. As well as overt warnings about the dangers of the virus, the government has been accused of feeding the public a non-stop diet of bad news, such as death rates and hospitalizations, without ever putting the figures into context with news of how many people have recovered or whether daily death tolls are above or below seasonal averages. Another member of SPIB said they were stunned by the weaponization of behavioral psychology during the pandemic, and that psychologists didn't seem to notice when it stopped being altruistic and became manipulative. They have too much power and it intoxicates them. Steve Baker, the deputy chairman of the COVID recovery group of Tory MPs, said, if it is true that the state took the decision to terrify the public to get compliance with rules, that raises extremely serious questions about the type of society we want to become. If we're being really honest, do I fear the government policy today is playing into the roots of totalitarianism? Yes, of course it is. So the quote-unquote reasonable fears you have of COVID and all those apocalyptic but necessary precautions you imposed on yourself, your family, and with your friends are the byproduct of an unethical and totalitarian regime by the government to make you feel more terrified of COVID than you should by amplifying, exaggerating, and emphasizing the threat of COVID in a way that is deemed unethical. They've admitted to weaponizing fear to control you, and they claim it's totalitarian. If you look up totalitarian, you'll see words like dictator, dictatorship, authoritarian, and oppressive. They are weaponizing fear to control your behavior and your reaction to the coronavirus. Sounds like something the Batman villain the Scarecrow would do. Now, in their book, they claim to regret what their propaganda has done to the public. So, when this masked man leaped out of harm's way to a safe distance when this other masked shopper got too close, the SPIB respond with,
"Oh no. What have we, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, done to the public? We only tried to terrify and brainwash the public enough to control their behavior, but we were too effective. Now everyone is irrationally treating everyone like they're biohazards. We regret this."
When this lady went into a Morrison's in a literal bubble and even had her carer sanitize the bubble if anyone touched it.
"Oh no. What have we, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, done to the public? We regret this."
When you think it's perfectly reasonable to share your personal private medical history just to get a cup of coffee or enter the supermarket.
"Oh no. What have we, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, done to the public? We regret this."
When you support segregating vaccinated citizens from unvaccinated citizens and champion the idea of unvaccinated citizens having an extremely difficult life until they conform and get vaccinated, because of the greater good.
"Oh no. What have we, the scientific pandemic influenza group on behavior done to the public. We regret this.
Or when you think wrapping your children in literal hazmat suits so they can hug their grandparents is justified and creative instead of cruel and insufferable.
Stop it. Get some help.
Each time this kind of thing occurs, the scientific pandemic influenza group on behavior laments to itself. What have we created? And regret its unethical totalitarian weaponization of psychology to increase the perceived level of personal threat from COVID-19, with the end goal of having the public feel sufficiently threatened by a disease they have an outstanding chance of surviving, concluding rightly that using fear is not an ethical stance for any modern government. They're lying to you. Not a conspiracy theory, it's on paper now, straight from the horse's mouth. Now, I believe that this point alone is enough to justify some skepticism and curiosity about the way this pandemic is being handled and presented. The excessive and relentless fear-mongering of the coronavirus being propagated by the media, politicians, social media, and the public has more to do with conditioning, control, and politics than it does public health. But I called COVID-19 remarkably survivable. Can I back that up? Maybe they needed to amplify the perceived threat of COVID because quick compliance was essential to mitigate fallout, and the world couldn't afford to wait until it got serious enough. Plus, the average Joe won't do the research to make informed decisions. So using fear was a necessary decision that may have been taken a bit too far. Similar to how parents, in a bid to avoid their kids ingesting cyanide-containing apple seeds, lovingly terrify their children to compliance by telling them the apple seeds will grow in their stomach, effectively killing them from the inside. It's the same as that, right? The government's just trying to take care of us. No, not at all. It's all political. Global survival rates. Let's do some math and calculate survival rates based on statistics gathered by Our World in Data, the gold standard in global statistics, trusted and used by Harvard University, Stanford, Berkeley, Cambridge, Oxford, and MIT. It's also the source Google uses anytime you search for demographics, COVID or otherwise. As of the 8th of November 2021, there have been a total of 250.37 million cases of coronavirus in the world. And of those 250.37 million cases, there have been 5.06 million deaths. To calculate survival rate, let's find out what percentage 5.06 million is of 250.37 million. The answer is 2.02%. Let's take 2.02 away from 100, leaving us with 97.98%, the survival rate. And just like that, to uncover the global survival rate of COVID-19, you can say you've done your own research and calculated that if you get coronavirus on planet Earth, including everyone and not accounting for any factors, you have a 97.98% chance of surviving, on average. To put a mortality or death rate of 2.02% into perspective, this rectangle is about to shrink by 2.02%. This is what a bar looks like shrunk 2.02%. And of course, this is what my baby Joe Gardner looks like, 2.02% smaller. I don't know about you, but I like those odds. At this point, I know, just from global trends alone, I've got a 97.98% chance of surviving COVID. Now, hopefully at this point, you're scratching your head and thinking,
oh, an almost 98% global chance of surviving COVID? I thought it would be much lower, but still, that doesn't account any factors, it's just the entire world, not accounting for population density, development, climate, age or anything. I think that everyone should just comply with mask mandates, social distancing and get the vaccine immediately so we can get over this pandemic already, or we'll need to go into another lockdown.
Common words. The wisdom of the masses. Factors influencing survival rates. But how much difference does masks, social distancing, vaccinations and lockdowns make? Maybe that's the reason it's 97.98%. To investigate this, we're going to compare the survival rates of a few selected countries. To explore vaccinations, we're going to look at Portugal, because it's the most vaccinated country in the world, achieved the highest vaccination rate in the world, and was the first country to reach 85% vaccination of its people. It's also the 35th most developed country out of 189 according to the United Nations Human Development Index, giving it the status of very high human development. Portugal will be compared to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC for short, because, according to our world of data, when it comes to COVID vaccinations, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is the least vaccinated country in the world, with just 0.04% of its 89.5 million people being vaccinated against the coronavirus. The DRC is also ranked in the United Nations Human Development Index, but unlike Portugal, the DRC is 175th out of 189, listing it as having low human development. To explore masks, since there isn't a most or least masked country in the world, I've selected the Philippines, since it has some of the most strictest mask mandates in the world that have not been lifted since April 2020. The Philippines is ranked as 107th most developed country out of 189 according to the Human Development Index. We will compare the Philippines with Sweden because it never imposed mask mandates, social distancing, didn't close the schools, and didn't have any lockdowns. Sweden is the 7th most developed country out of 189 according to the Human Development Index. We will reuse Sweden to compare lockdowns too, since there isn't many countries that have not had any lockdowns, and Sweden makes a good example. We will compare Sweden to Australia, since it's the most locked down country in the world, and is very relevant to the purpose of this video, to expose Australia's COVID insanity. Voila! The purpose of this table is to preemptively respond to a likely response being that
the reason global survivability from COVID-19 is 98% is because of vaccinations, lockdowns, social distancing and mask mandates.
Are you sure about that?
Before we crunch the numbers, please take a moment to appreciate what we're investigating here with this comparison. If vaccines are vital, necessary and effective against the deadly COVID-19 virus, then a comparison between the most vaccinated country, Portugal, with the least vaccinated country, the DRC, should reflect that fact. If masks and social distancing are vital, necessary and effective against the deadly COVID-19 virus, then a comparison between the strict and uneasing mask mandates and social distancing guidelines of the Philippines with Sweden, one of the few countries to not impose any mask mandates or social distancing, should reflect that fact. If lockdowns are vital, necessary and effective against the deadly COVID-19 virus, then comparing Australia, the most locked down country in the world, with Sweden, who not only didn't mandate masks or social distancing, but never imposed any lockdowns during the entire pandemic, should reflect that fact. If, on the other hand, all these countries reflect virtually no difference in survival rates, regardless of vaccination rates, mask mandates, social distancing measures, lockdowns, human development, which indicates how healthy, educated and wealthy a people is, and even population, then I feel confident claiming that, for the vast, overwhelming majority of the humans on planet Earth, COVID vaccines, masks, social distancing and lockdowns are most definitely not vital, necessary or effective. Now that we know what we're looking for, let's fill in the COVID cases and death statistics gathered from our world of data. So here we can see how many people caught COVID in these countries. This is how many people died. The leftover is how many survived. This calculation will give us the death rate for each country, shown here, and subtracting the death rate from 100% will give us the survival rate, shown here. Now take a moment and look at these figures. The most vaccinated country in the world has a survival rate of 98.35%, compared with a survival rate of 98.06% for the least vaccinated country in the world. That's a difference of 0.29% for Portugal. Let's not forget that Portugal was 140 times more developed than the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Interesting finding. The country with one of the strictest mask mandates in the world has a survival rate of 98.42%, compared with a survival rate of 98.73% to the country who never imposed masks or social distancing. That's a difference of 0.31% against the Philippines, and it looks like Sweden fared better. Interesting finding. The most locked down country in the world has a survival rate of 98.99%, compared with a survival rate of 98.73% for a country which never had a lockdown. That's a difference of 0.26% for Australia. Not much difference at all. Interesting finding. But, oh my god, wait a minute, look at this. Do you see what I see? The survival rates for all these countries is 98%. Oh my god!
Oh my god! Wow! Oh my god!
But that can't be. Everyone knows that COVID-19 is a deadly pandemic that will kill everyone unless we get vaccinated straight away, mask up, and maintain social distancing. Oh, wait. It's not even a factor.
Pow!
If you're feeling uncomfortable looking at this table, it's because the narrative for COVID is so chronic that any criticism of the government's approach to COVID, no matter how ridiculous, is met with buzzword accusations like anti-vaxxer, anti-science, COVID denier, grandma killer, and more. And you're just sucked up into that mess. Speaking of grandma, wouldn't the elderly be more vulnerable and therefore have a more serious survival rate that warrants these measures? Wouldn't specific age groups representing a smaller slice of the global population have a greater death rate? You're absolutely right. Survival rates by age. If we looked at data collected from the Centre for Disease Controls and Prevention, more commonly known as the CDC, we can find demographic trends of COVID-19 cases and deaths in the US reported to CDC. If you scroll down to cases by age group and deaths by age group, you'll get two Excel documents. This is cases by age, and this is deaths by age. Using this data, we can input it into a new table that will allow us to measure the death rate and survival rate per age group. Are you ready? Behold. Take a moment to absorb what this data actually shows. Essentially, if you're under 50 years old, you're virtually immune to COVID. Since September 2021, when I turned 30, I belong to this demographic and have an apparent survival rate of 99.836% and a death rate of 0.164%. As you can imagine, I am terrified. I will continue to take my booster shots, take regular PCR tests, sanitize everything I touch, maintain social distancing, minimize travel to only essential purposes, always wear my mask outdoors and indoors, and refrain from breaking any bubbles unless 100% necessary.
Oh no. What have we, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, done to the public? We regret this.
Aside from imminent death by COVID for all ages, you'll also notice that ages from 50 and up show a considerably greater risk of dying from the disease, which is why those in the vulnerable group of 50 and up should seek the vaccine if they want it. If we pass it on to them as transmitters, the vaccine will prevent them from getting very sick. As far as I see it, that and only that is the justified approach to this pandemic based off the data we have, because the alternative is having children with a death rate of less than 0.05% and a survival rate of over 99.9%, wear masks in schools, be forced to take the vaccine just to go to school and get an education, and force them to social distance while playing. I think that is completely unnecessary, a waste of time, life, and resources, and downright cruel. Children shouldn't need to mask up, get vaccinated, and be regularly tested for COVID unless they're vulnerable.
But what about long COVID? Sure, they won't die often, but the threat from long COVID is very real and disproportionately harms children.
Long COVID. According to the BBC, most people who catch COVID won't become severely ill and will get better relatively quickly. But some have had long-term problems after recovering from the original infection, even if they weren't very ill in the first place. However, research suggests long COVID may be less common than previously thought, and fewer children are affected than was feared. They continue in another article to state that 1 in 40 people with coronavirus has symptoms lasting at least 3 months, Office for National Statistics figures suggest. They also say that long COVID in children nowhere near scale fear. Is that word feared again? The risk of long COVID in children is much lower than many had feared, leading child health experts have said. After the world's biggest study into the issue, the researchers, led by University College London, said they were reassured. The research suggests somewhere between 2 and 14% still have symptoms caused by COVID 15 weeks later. But there was little evidence huge numbers had sought NHS help for symptoms that had left them bedridden or unable to attend school. So no, I don't think it's appropriate to destroy the livelihoods of billions of people because 2 to 14% of children with a 99.9% survival rate may have symptoms for 15 weeks and then fully recover. If you're vulnerable due to age or a compromised immune system, understandable. Get the shot. Those antibodies will kickstart your immune system and give you the best chance of surviving. Otherwise, healthy young people with functioning healthy immune systems have no need and should not be expected to undertake any unnecessary medical procedure and risk heart inflammation by getting the vaccine, a risk currently being studied out of Israel, which found that there is a probable link between receiving the second dose of Pfizer vaccine and the appearance of myocarditis amongst men aged 16 to 30, it said in the statement. According to the findings, such a link was observed among men aged 16 to 19 than in other age groups. A US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention advisory group last month recommended further study of the possibility of a link between myocarditis and the mRNA vaccine, which includes those from Pfizer and Moderna. In a May 24th meeting, the CDC advisory group said that the data from the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, which relies on individuals to report results, showed a higher than expected number of observed myocarditis and pericarditis cases in 16 to 24-year-olds. Now, I believe this is a fair compromise. The vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID. We know that now. It does, allegedly, improve your resilience and prevents you from getting very sick. So if you're vulnerable to getting very sick from COVID, take the vaccine. If everyone else takes it or doesn't take it, it doesn't affect your chances at all. Does everyone else need to be on a diet or else yours won't work? No, you take control of your own caloric intake and exercise. Does the government need to mandate jackets this winter so that everyone else doesn't freeze? No, use your own common sense to judge your outfits if you're concerned about the cold. Protect your own safety. Does everyone need to wear a helmet when they're outside because you're prone to falling off your bike because you have poor balance? No. Wear your helmet and take responsibility for your own safety within your means. If you have a headache, does everyone else need to take a paracetamol in order for yours to work? No. Take the medicine that addresses your ailment and let everyone be. Likewise, if you're vulnerable to getting sick from COVID, does everyone else need to get the vaccine, wear a mask, stay indoors, be prevented from returning home, social distance at all times, and sanitize every surface they touch, or else your health is at risk? No. If you're vulnerable, get the vaccine and apply common sense measures and approach the situation logically. Essentially, if your response's idea is,
well, I have a compromised immune system, plus asthma runs in my family and my grandpa has respiratory problems, so...
well, then get the vaccine and now you're safe. Done. Not, oh, then I'll get the vaccine too because of your compromised immune system. Never mind that I'm not vulnerable to the vaccine. Anything you wish, princess. Take this bizarre clip shown earlier, for example. Here we can see a mother donning her children in literal hazmat suits, just so they can give their grandparents a hug. It's a disgusting display of cowardice, lack of critical thinking, and no historical perspective. But that aside, the thinking is that grandma and grandpa are vulnerable. So to protect them from COVID being passed on by the children, which isn't very likely by the way, as seen in an Icelandic study that confirmed that schools aren't the primary drivers of outbreaks. This 40,000 person study found that children under 15 were about half as likely as adults to be infected, and only half as likely as adults to transmit the virus to others. Almost all coronavirus transmissions to children came from adults. But back to the crazy thing. The thought process is likely, grandparents are vulnerable, children can pass on the virus. Best put them in hazmat suits so they can hug without risk. Now, I submit to you an alternative idea. Get your grandparents vaccinated and let them hug their grandchildren. If you do, everyone is safe. If the grandparents are not safe after being vaccinated, the vaccine is ineffective, unnecessary, and doesn't work. Make it make sense. Hi, thank you for watching The Truth About COVID from Stranded Australia, Episode 1. In this episode, I wanted to show COVID in context. In Episode 2, I want to present the COVID restrictions as being far more deadly than COVID itself. And finally, in Episode 3, I want to portray Australia as going absolutely insane, full totalitarian. I hope you enjoy this series and has given you something to think about. I've put a lot of research into this, and I would recommend that you would share it to somebody that would like to see it. If you know somebody who the SPIB would look at and say, oh no, what have we done? Let them see this video. Let them see firsthand that their behaviour is somebody else's regret. Please like and share, and in the comment section, let me know what you think. I'll be reading them and I'll be responding. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in episode 2.